Respect didn't die that day because someone shouted. It died because nobody cared enough to stop what was happening. A man who had carried the weight of this family for decades sat in the middle of the room and realized, with a quiet kind of shock, that his voice had become optional. Not wrong. Not outdated. Just unnecessary. And the worst part was how easy it was for everyone else to keep smiling while it happened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a harmless oversight. It was a public decision made in front of him like he was furniture, present, familiar, and ignored. The room stayed calm, polite, almost warm. Coffee cups on the table. Old photos on the wall. People speaking gently as if kindness could cover what they were doing. But beneath the comfort was something colder. The moment they moved forward without asking him, they told him exactly where he stood. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't demand respect like a man trying to prove he still mattered. He sat there with his hands folded, posture straight, expression controlled, holding himself together the way he always had. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was dignity protecting itself. But dignity has a cost when nobody recognizes it. It becomes a private burden, carried silently while everyone else enjoys the peace it creates. And then there was the grandson, quiet, unnoticed, watching from the edge of the room like a witness no one remembered to account for. The boy saw the moment land. He saw how eyes avoided the grandfather right after the decision was finalized. He saw the delayed concern that came only after it was safe. He saw the smiles that acted like nothing had happened. And something inside him tightened, not with anger, but with a kind of helpless grief. Because he understood, even if he couldn't explain it, that love can fail someone without ever saying a cruel word. The grandfather felt it too. Shame doesn't need insults. Shame is what happens when nobody defends you. When your lifetime of sacrifice is treated like background noise. When you become a man everyone relies on, but no one consults. He sat among the people he had protected and realized that being needed was not the same as being respected. Not anymore. The room recovered quickly. It always does. Laughter returned. Conversations moved on. People acted relieved that nothing uncomfortable had been said out loud. But the grandson didn't move. He stood there holding the truth everyone else avoided. Respect had just been taken from the grandfather in front of the whole family, and nobody stopped it. And the grandfather still didn't react, so they assumed he was fine. They mistook patience for permission. They mistook silence for consent. They didn't understand what the boy understood in that moment. Some silences don't disappear. They wait. They mature. And one day, they come back, clean, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. After the moment passed, the room did what it was practiced at doing. It recovered. Conversations resumed with a careful lightness, as though everyone had silently agreed to move forward without examining what had just occurred. Smiles appeared again, slightly too quick, slightly too rehearsed. Someone shifted the topic to something safer, something neutral, and the discomfort dissolved just enough to make it bearable. This was how families survived awkward truths, by smoothing them over before they could settle. The grandfather remained where he was, unchanged in posture but altered in something less visible. Inside him, restraint took over the way it always had. He did not replay the moment with bitterness. He did not search faces for acknowledgement. He understood the rhythm of people well enough to know that drawing attention to the wound would only make others uncomfortable, not more accountable. His silence was not denial. It was containment, a way of keeping the fracture from spreading. Around him, concerns surfaced selectively. It appeared in softened voices and brief glances that did not linger long enough to invite responsibility. Someone asked a general question meant for the room, not for him specifically. Another offered a smile that carried reassurance without engagement. These gestures were not cruel, but they were insufficient. They treated the situation as something already resolved, something that did not require repair. Social etiquette played its role efficiently. Politeness created a shield that protected everyone except the one who had been quietly diminished. The unspoken rule was clear: addressing discomfort directly would be impolite, and politeness mattered more than correction. In that environment, shame did not need reinforcement. It sustained itself through avoidance. The grandfather felt this acutely, not as humiliation, but as a quiet understanding that the system favored ease over fairness. The grandson watched from his place near the edge of the room, absorbing details adults did not notice themselves. He saw the way shoulders shifted when the grandfather's presence became inconvenient. He noticed pauses that stretched a second too long before someone spoke again. He paid attention to who met his grandfather's eyes and who suddenly found something else to focus on. These small movements told a story no one intended to tell. To the boy, it felt like watching something important being filed away without documentation. He did not yet have the language for it, but he sensed that the grandfather's sacrifices had never been recorded in any formal way. They lived only in memory, in routines, in years that no one thought to itemize. The room was full of spoken plans and future intentions, yet the past, the foundation of everything, went unacknowledged. The metaphor of paperwork would have made sense to the grandfather. His life had been shaped by records, responsibilities, and processes that demanded patience. He knew that what went undocumented was often treated as expendable. In that moment, he understood that his contributions existed only as assumptions, not as facts anyone felt obligated to revisit. And assumptions, once ignored, faded quickly. Inside him, there was no anger. There was disappointment, tempered by acceptance. He had lived long enough to recognize that people often mistook availability for permanence. He remained composed because reacting would have required explaining something that others had already chosen not to see. His restraint was not a weakness. It was a boundary, quietly maintained. The grandson felt a different reaction growing inside him. It was not rage, but something heavier, an early sense of injustice paired with helplessness. He wanted the moment to be acknowledged, to be corrected, but he understood instinctively that speaking would change his position in the room. Silence became his shield, just as it had been his grandfather's. He learned, without instruction, that observation sometimes came before action. As the gathering continued, laughter returned more naturally. The tension thinned until it was barely noticeable. Yet the boy knew it had not disappeared. It had simply been buried under routine and politeness. He realized then that silence could humiliate louder than words ever could, because it allowed everyone to claim innocence. Nothing had been said, so nothing had to be answered for. The grandfather eventually stood, steady and unhurried, moving through the room with the same quiet dignity he always carried. No one stopped him. No one apologized. Life flowed on. But the grandson remained still, watching the space his grandfather left behind, understanding for the first time that some moments demand memory rather than reaction. In that silence, the boy made a decision he could not yet articulate. He would not interrupt. He would not confront. He would watch. He would wait. Because if this was how respect disappeared, then understanding how it vanished might one day explain how it could return. In the days that followed, nothing appeared different on the surface. The house returned to its familiar rhythms, the kind that made moments like the one that had passed feel unreal, almost imagined. The grandfather woke at the same time each morning, moved through his routines with the same measured pace, and carried himself as though no invisible line had been crossed. To anyone else, it would have looked like resilience. To the boy, it looked like something far more complex. The grandson began to notice details he had never paid attention to before. He watched how his grandfather folded the newspaper with care, how he organized papers into neat stacks even when no one asked him to. He observed the way meals were eaten without commentary, gratitude expressed quietly, habits unchanged. There was no sign of resentment, no withdrawal. The man who had been quietly dismissed continued to live as though his place in the world had not been altered, and that steadiness unsettled the boy more than anger ever could have. What the grandson was learning, without instruction, was the discipline of observation. He understood instinctively that reacting would have been easier, louder, and ultimately forgettable. Watching required patience. It demanded restraint. The narrator's voice would later frame this lesson simply: power does not live in reactions. Power lives in memory. It accumulates in the details we carry forward, not the words we throw back in the moment. The grandfather embodied that truth without explaining it. He did not reference what had happened. He did not seek reassurance or correction. His dignity remained intact, even as the contrast between how he carried himself and how he had been treated lingered in the air. The boy felt that contrast deeply. It created a tension inside him, a quiet ache born from recognizing that dignity did not guarantee respect, but it preserved something more enduring. As weeks passed, the grandson began to see his grandfather's life as a series of unrecorded contributions. There were no formal acknowledgments, no written accounts of the sacrifices made quietly over years. The boy started to think of memory itself as documentation. Each remembered moment became a record, each observation a line written somewhere invisible but permanent. If no one else was keeping track, he would. He noticed how his grandfather continued to show up for others without expectation. Errands were run, responsibilities fulfilled, favors granted without being named as such. None of it came with reminders of past service. This was not forgiveness spoken aloud. It was forgiveness practiced silently, through consistency and grace. The boy felt both comforted and unsettled by it. Comforted by the gentleness. Unsettled by the realization that such goodness could still be overlooked. The lesson was not about endurance alone. It was about timing. The boy began to understand that some moments were not meant to be addressed immediately. Some truths required distance to be fully understood. The phrase formed quietly in his mind, not as a declaration but as an internal promise. He would watch, and he would wait. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of what he was witnessing. There was no desire for revenge taking shape inside him. What grew instead was clarity. He saw that reacting would have shifted the focus away from the real issue and onto the reaction itself. Silence, when chosen deliberately, allowed the truth to remain undistorted. The grandfather seemed to understand this intuitively, living his life as though the moment had already been processed and placed where it belonged. The emotional contrast remained sharp. The boy felt it each time he saw his grandfather treated politely but peripherally. Dignity remained present, acknowledgement did not. That imbalance taught him something about the world that no lesson ever had. It showed him that respect could be conditional, but character was not. And character, once observed closely, left a deeper impression than any public correction ever could. As time moved forward, the memory of that afternoon did not fade for the grandson. It matured. It became layered with context and understanding. He began to see how systems, families included, often relied on the quiet endurance of a few while celebrating the voices of many. He saw how easily silence could be misinterpreted, and how patience could be mistaken for permission. The grandfather continued on, unchanged in manner, but the boy sensed that something had shifted internally. Not bitterness, but awareness. A recognition of limits, perhaps. Or an acceptance that some roles evolve without announcement. The boy did not ask. He did not intrude. He understood that not every lesson required explanation. What mattered was that the moment had been recorded, carefully and completely, in the boy's memory. It was stored alongside countless small observations, forming a quiet archive of truth. He realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that this memory would matter later. Not immediately, not loudly, but inevitably. And as he watched his grandfather move through another ordinary day, the boy understood that patience was not passive. It was preparation. The moment had passed, but its significance had not. And somewhere deep inside, the grandson knew that one day, when timing finally aligned, what he had seen would demand to be understood. Concern arrived later, long after the moment had passed and the room had returned to its comfortable order. It surfaced not as urgency, but as careful curiosity, framed in questions that required no real answers. Family members checked in indirectly, asking how things were going in general, how routines were holding up, how the days felt lately. It was concern that stayed safely on the surface, never dipping deep enough to disturb what had already been decided. The grandson noticed the timing immediately. Concern did not appear when it could have changed something. It arrived only after the risk had passed, once discomfort could be acknowledged without responsibility. He watched how voices softened now, how expressions carried a rehearsed gentleness that felt more like self-protection than care. Nothing about it was cruel. That was what made it harder to name. Fear had learned to dress itself in manners. Respect, he began to understand, could be performed without ever being practiced. It lived in tone rather than action, in polite gestures rather than meaningful inclusion. The family knew how to appear considerate. They knew how to ask questions that sounded attentive while steering clear of accountability. The grandfather responded to these gestures with the same calm steadiness he offered everything else. He did not correct them. He did not withdraw. He accepted the concern for what it was, without asking it to be more. As days unfolded, fragments of the grandfather's past surfaced quietly, not through stories he told, but through moments the grandson began to notice more clearly. Old habits revealed long patterns of service. There were routines that suggested years of responsibility carried without acknowledgement. The boy started to see the shape of a life built on consistency rather than recognition. Sacrifices had been made in silence, choices aligned with duty instead of comfort, all without expectation of praise. The narrator's presence lingered gently over these realizations, guiding without judgment. There was moral unease in recognizing how easily such lives could be overlooked once they no longer served immediate needs. The family had benefited from the grandfather's steadiness for so long that it had begun to feel inevitable, permanent. When that steadiness no longer shaped decisions, concern arrived as a way to soothe guilt rather than correct imbalance. The grandson did not blame individuals. He observed patterns. He noticed how concern increased when inconvenience threatened, how respect softened into nostalgia rather than action. He saw how fear of disruption kept conversations polite and shallow. Not all care, he learned, was honest. Some of it existed to protect the comfort of the caregiver more than the dignity of the one being cared for. The grandfather's response remained consistent. He listened. He nodded. He thanked people for their concern without leaning into it. His acceptance was not resignation. It was clarity. He seemed to understand that forcing awareness rarely produced understanding. What mattered more was alignment with his own values. He continued his routines, maintained his standards, and offered grace where others offered delayed recognition. The grandson felt a growing mix of admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the restraint that allowed such grace. Sorrow for the realization that goodness often went unnoticed until it became optional. He felt the quiet weight of inherited guilt, not because he had caused the moment, but because he had seen it and could not unsee it. Watching had taught him empathy, but it had also taught him how lonely integrity could be. In private moments, the grandfather's past revealed itself through small, unspoken details. Carefully organized documents hinted at years of responsibility. Familiar routes taken without hesitation suggested habits formed through necessity. The boy began to understand that this man had lived his life in service not to applause, but to structure, believing that systems mattered and that consistency would eventually speak for itself. Family concern continued in its gentle, distant way. It never crossed into apology. It never asked to revisit the moment that had shifted everything. The avoidance was subtle, but complete. The grandson saw now that fear was not always dramatic. Sometimes it simply avoided the truth while maintaining a pleasant expression. The moral tension settled quietly into the story. No one was entirely wrong. No one was entirely right. That was what made the unease linger. The grandfather had not been mistreated with intent, but intent did not erase impact. The family's fear of disruption had dressed itself as concern, and everyone had accepted the costume. One evening, away from the room where it had all begun, the grandson witnessed something he had not expected. In a quiet, private moment, the grandfather made a small decision that went unnoticed by everyone else. It was not announced. It was not explained. But it carried weight. The boy sensed that this choice was connected to everything that had happened, shaped by acceptance rather than resentment. He did not yet understand its full meaning, only that it marked a turning point. Concern had come too late to change the past, but decisions made in private had a way of shaping the future. The grandson watched, heart steady, realizing that what he had been observing was not just hypocrisy, but the beginning of something quietly irreversible. Time did not announce its arrival. It moved quietly, the way it always does, smoothing sharp edges without erasing what caused them. The seasons changed, routines adjusted, and the family settled into a new normal that felt stable on the surface. What had once been raw gradually became unspoken, folded into habit. The memory of that afternoon did not fade, it matured. It waited. The grandson grew older in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared. His awareness deepened. He learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. He still did not bring up the moment that had altered everything. Silence remained his chosen posture, not out of fear, but out of respect for timing. He had learned from watching that words spoken too early could fracture meaning, while patience allowed truth to reveal itself on its own terms. Family dynamics shifted as they often do when time reshapes priorities. Some voices grew more confident, others more cautious. Roles adjusted without ceremony. Decisions were made with efficiency, framed as progress. The grandfather's presence remained steady, though his influence appeared to have narrowed. He was consulted less, thanked more vaguely, acknowledged without being engaged. It was a soft marginalization, easy to miss if one was not looking for it. The narrator lingered gently on the idea of timing as a moral force. Not all lessons demand immediate correction. Some require distance, not to dull their impact, but to clarify it. Waiting, in this sense, was not forgetting. It was remembering with intention. The grandson carried the memory like a sealed envelope, unopened but intact, aware that its contents would matter when circumstances aligned. The grandfather's silence, once mistaken for acceptance, now revealed itself as deliberate. It was no longer simply restraint, it was choice. He continued to show up, to help where asked, to offer kindness without condition. But he also began to redraw boundaries quietly. Certain responsibilities were declined without explanation. Certain assumptions were allowed to expire. Nothing was announced. Nothing needed to be. This shift did not feel punitive. It felt honest. The grandfather understood that continuing to give without being seen could quietly erode self-respect. His acceptance had evolved into discernment. Grace, he knew, did not require self-erasure. The grandson sensed this change and felt a deepening respect for it. What looked like withdrawal was actually alignment, an adjustment toward balance. As years passed, the family grew accustomed to this version of stability. The absence of conflict created a false sense of resolution. Everyone believed the moment had passed completely, that time had healed what had never been addressed. Politeness remained intact. Concern appeared occasionally, still careful, still non-intrusive. The system functioned, and that seemed sufficient. But memory does not exist to accuse. It exists to prepare. The grandson understood this now. He had watched long enough to recognize patterns. He saw how decisions were made when convenience was abundant, and how values shifted when it was not. He understood that timing was not about opportunity, it was about necessity. When people needed something, they listened differently. The grandfather's routines continued, but with quiet adjustments. Files were organized, records maintained, habits refined. He moved through his days with the calm assurance of someone who had already made peace with what could not be changed. There was no bitterness in him. Only clarity. He had learned to let memory do the work that confrontation could not. The emotional shift arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly. The grandson felt it first as a sense of anticipation, not excitement, but readiness. He did not know what would happen or when. He only knew that the story was not finished. The patience he had practiced was beginning to feel purposeful. Waiting had shaped him, taught him to trust the slow unfolding of consequence. Then circumstances changed. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough to unsettle the balance the family had grown comfortable with. A situation emerged that required experience rather than confidence, depth rather than efficiency. For the first time in a long while, the family faced a moment that could not be smoothed over with politeness alone. The grandson noticed the shift immediately. Conversations slowed. Questions carried weight. The room felt different, not tense, but uncertain. The kind of uncertainty that reveals dependency. It became clear, without being stated, that the grandfather's knowledge and steadiness were suddenly relevant again. He did not step forward. He did not remind anyone of his past role. He waited, just as he always had. His silence now carried a different meaning. It was not absence. It was leverage born of time and memory. The family felt it before they named it, sensing that something essential had been overlooked and could no longer be ignored. The grandson watched closely, heart steady. He understood now why waiting mattered. Not because it delayed justice, but because it allowed truth to arrive without force. The moment he had carried for so long had not disappeared. It had been preparing this exact convergence. As the family turned, quietly and carefully, toward the grandfather, the grandson felt the weight of what was coming. This was not a return to the past. It was a reckoning with it. And for the first time since that afternoon years ago, it was clear that the memory they had all avoided was about to demand acknowledgement. The shift did not arrive with urgency. It came quietly, disguised as practicality, wrapped in the language of necessity rather than apology. The family did not suddenly rediscover reverence. They discovered need. And in that discovery, the shape of respect began to change. Circumstances unfolded slowly, the way real consequences often do. A situation emerged that required more than confidence or convenience. It required experience, steadiness, and an understanding built over years rather than moments. What had once been optional now felt essential. The systems the family relied on began to strain, and familiarity alone was no longer enough to hold things together. The grandson noticed the first signs before anyone named them. Conversations that once moved quickly now paused. Questions were asked more carefully. There was a return to phrasing that sought confirmation rather than consensus. The tone in the room shifted from certainty to consideration. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Something that had been dismissed was now being quietly searched for again. The grandfather did not change his behavior. He did not remind anyone of his past role or reference the moment that had reshaped everything. He did not offer commentary or guidance unless asked. His posture remained calm, his routines intact. The absence of reaction was deliberate. Dignity, he understood, did not require reinforcement. It did not need to announce its return. When the family turned toward him, it was not dramatic. There were no formal acknowledgments, no spoken admissions of oversight. Respect began to surface in small ways, longer pauses, attentive listening, careful phrasing. It was not reverence, but it was recognition. And recognition, when it arrives after neglect, carries a different weight. The narrator lingered on the quiet truth unfolding in the room. Dignity never begs. It does not argue for relevance. It waits. When respect returns out of necessity rather than virtue, it still returns, shaped by timing rather than intention. The grandfather seemed to understand this fully. He did not confuse need with remorse, nor did he resent it. The grandson observed the reversal with a steady heart. He saw how quickly tone could shift when convenience ended. He noted how easily voices softened when certainty dissolved. There was no satisfaction in this awareness, only clarity. Watching had taught him that power did not require confrontation. It revealed itself when circumstances demanded humility. No lectures followed. The grandfather offered no reminders of what had been overlooked. He did not burden the moment with guilt or expectation. His restraint remained intact, guided by an understanding that forcing acknowledgement often cheapened it. Grace, when practiced honestly, allowed others to arrive at awareness without being pushed. The emotional texture of the room changed. There was tension, but it was not hostile. It was reflective. The family moved more slowly, more deliberately, as though recalibrating something they had taken for granted. The absence of accusation made space for something else, an unspoken recognition of balance restored, not through apology, but through alignment. The grandson felt a quiet ache of recognition. This was what waiting had prepared him for. Not vindication, not triumph, but understanding. Respect had not returned because it was deserved, though it always had been. It returned because it was necessary. And necessity stripped away the comfort of dismissal. The grandfather engaged when appropriate, offered insight when requested, and withdrew when his presence was no longer required. His responses were measured, thoughtful, free of commentary on the past. There was no performance of forgiveness, only its quiet practice. Acceptance did not erase memory, but it softened its edges, allowing the present to move forward without resentment. The family adapted. They did not speak about the change directly, but they lived into it. There was a renewed attentiveness, an awareness that some contributions could not be replaced easily. Respect, once withheld without consequence, now carried weight. Not because it was demanded, but because its absence had revealed a gap no one else could fill. The grandson watched closely, understanding now that dignity did not need validation to remain intact. It endured through consistency, patience, and timing. The moment that had once felt unbearable had not been erased by time. It had been reframed, given context, and allowed to mature into something meaningful. Then, in a moment that passed without ceremony, the grandfather made a choice. It was quiet, personal, and unexplained. He accepted one responsibility and declined another. No justification followed. No context was offered. The decision stood on its own, grounded in self-respect rather than obligation. The grandson sensed the significance immediately. This was not withdrawal. It was discernment. The grandfather was no longer operating from habit or expectation. He was choosing deliberately, aligning his actions with his worth. The family felt the shift without understanding it fully, aware only that something essential had settled into place. Respect had returned, not with celebration, but with gravity. And as the grandfather moved forward without explanation, it became clear that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of its quiet resolution. The outcome did not arrive with a reckoning. There was no meeting called to revisit the past, no careful language constructed to soften what had already been learned. Life simply continued, and in that continuation, the consequences of earlier choices settled into place with a quiet finality. Nothing dramatic happened, which was precisely what made it unmistakable. When consequences are clean, they do not announce themselves. They become part of the air. The family adjusted without discussion. Roles shifted subtly, responsibilities redistributed in ways that felt practical rather than corrective. Some assumptions quietly dissolved. Others were never taken up again. No one spoke about what had changed, yet everyone felt it. The absence of confrontation forced reflection inward, where it could not be deflected or managed. Each person was left alone with their own understanding of how things had reached this point. The grandfather remained steady through it all. He did not accept apologies because none were offered, and he did not need them. He understood that remorse spoken aloud often served the speaker more than the listener. What mattered was not acknowledgement, but alignment. And alignment, he could see, was finally taking shape. People listened differently now. Decisions moved more slowly. There was a weight to consideration that had been missing before. He did not correct anyone. He did not revisit the moment that had once defined the fracture. His restraint continued to guide him, not as endurance, but as choice. Forgiveness, in his quiet way, was not a declaration. It was an absence of resentment. It was the refusal to weaponize memory, even when memory would have justified it. The grandson watched the resolution unfold with a growing sense of clarity. This was the lesson he had been moving toward all along. Justice did not need to be loud to be complete. When earned, it arrived without spectacle, without forcing anyone to bow or confess. It simply rebalanced what had been misaligned. The boy felt the satisfaction not as triumph, but as relief. Something that had been unresolved inside him finally settled. The family, left without a moment of public closure, had no choice but to reflect privately. Without confrontation to respond to, there was nothing to defend against. Without accusation, there was no enemy to push back. Each person had to sit with their own memory of that afternoon and reconcile it with what they now understood. The process was uncomfortable, but honest. Silence, once used to avoid responsibility, now required it. The grandfather's presence remained unchanged, yet its meaning had deepened. He was no longer overlooked, but neither was he elevated. The balance felt right. He offered guidance when asked and withheld it when not. His acceptance was steady, his grace unperformative. He did not need validation to confirm his worth. He had already aligned himself with it. The narrator's voice rested gently on the truth beneath it all. Justice, when it is earned rather than demanded, feels quiet. It does not rush. It does not insist on recognition. It restores equilibrium and then steps back, allowing life to continue without keeping score. The family did not celebrate this resolution because celebration would have misunderstood it. This was not a victory. It was a correction. The grandson felt the final pieces of the lesson settle into place. Watching had taught him patience. Waiting had taught him timing. Now understanding taught him restraint. He saw clearly that speaking too soon would have distorted the outcome. Silence had not been passive. It had been active, deliberate, and ultimately transformative. There was warmth in this realization, not bitterness. The boy did not feel anger toward his family, nor did he feel the need to judge them. He recognized how easily people could slip into convenience, how quickly manners could replace mindfulness. What mattered was that awareness had arrived, even if it had taken time. Grace allowed room for growth without erasing accountability. The grandfather moved through his days with a quiet ease that suggested closure without declaration. He had not reclaimed authority. He had reclaimed alignment. His choices reflected self-respect rather than obligation, and that distinction mattered. The family adapted to this without naming it, sensing that something had resolved itself in a way that could not be undone. The grandson stood at the edge of this understanding, feeling both lighter and more responsible. He carried the full lesson now, not as a grievance, but as a compass. He understood what dignity looked like when it did not demand recognition, what patience could accomplish when it trusted timing, and what justice felt like when it arrived without noise. There was no final conversation to mark the end of this chapter. No closing gesture. Life continued, shaped subtly but permanently by what had been learned. And as the boy watched his grandfather move forward with calm assurance, he made a quiet decision of his own. He would not forget. Not out of resentment, but out of respect. Memory, he understood now, was not meant to reopen wounds. It was meant to preserve lessons. And this one, earned slowly and resolved cleanly, was too important to let fade. Time passed, not as a clean break from what had happened, but as a quiet continuation shaped by it. The years did not erase the memory, they refined it. What once felt heavy and unresolved softened into something steadier, something usable. The grandson grew into adulthood carrying the imprint of that afternoon, not as a scar, but as a lens through which he understood people, systems, and silence. The grandfather's presence faded gradually, the way meaningful presences often do. There was no single moment that marked an ending. What remained was not authority, not control, not even reputation. What endured was restraint. A way of holding oneself without demanding acknowledgement. A way of choosing patience when reaction would have been easier. The grandson understood, with time, that this had been the grandfather's real legacy. Not power exercised over others, but power preserved within himself. In the grandson's own life, this lesson surfaced in unexpected places. In meetings where someone's idea was brushed aside too quickly. In family conversations where an elder's experience was treated as background noise rather than guidance. In moments where politeness disguised avoidance, and silence was mistaken for consent. Each time, he felt that familiar pause inside him, the one that asked him to look more closely before acting. He did not become loud. He did not become confrontational. He became attentive. He learned to recognize when silence was protective and when it was harmful. He learned that patience was not passive if it was chosen with intention. Sometimes he spoke, calmly and without spectacle, creating space where respect had been overlooked. Other times, he waited, trusting that timing would reveal truths that urgency would only distort. The narrator's presence remained gentle here, refusing to turn experience into instruction. There was no sermon in what the grandson carried forward, only awareness. Power, he had learned, lived in patience, not volume. It lived in the ability to endure discomfort without abandoning dignity. It lived in memory held carefully, not thrown back as accusation. The grandfather's way of moving through the world had taught him this without ever naming it. The grandson remembered how silence had been misunderstood as weakness, and how time had quietly corrected that misunderstanding. He remembered how respect had returned not through demand, but through necessity. And he remembered how clean consequences had required no apologies to be complete. As the grandson aged, he noticed how often people mistook quiet people for powerless ones. How systems rewarded confidence over consistency. How easily shame could be normalized through etiquette and delay. These observations did not harden him. They softened him. They gave him empathy for those who were overlooked and patience with those who did the overlooking, often without malice. Forgiveness, he learned, was not an event. It was a posture. It did not mean forgetting what had happened or excusing it. It meant refusing to let memory become bitterness. The grandson carried memory the way his grandfather had, carefully, deliberately, without allowing it to poison what came next. Guilt, when it appeared, was met with grace. Not grace that erased responsibility, but grace that allowed growth. The story did not resolve into triumph. There was no moment where the grandson felt vindicated or superior. That was never the point. What he felt instead was alignment. A sense that the values he lived by were coherent, tested, and chosen. He knew when to step forward and when to step back. He knew that some silences needed to be broken, and others needed to be honored. The grandfather's legacy lived on not in stories told loudly, but in habits passed quietly. In the grandson's refusal to humiliate others, even when correcting them. In his resistance to using power performatively. In his understanding that dignity, once compromised, could not be restored through spectacle. It required time, patience, and a willingness to let consequences speak for themselves. As the narrator stepped back, the audience was left without a conclusion that wrapped everything neatly. Instead, they were left with recognition. The kind that lingers after the screen goes dark. The kind that invites reflection rather than resolution. Families, workplaces, communities, all of them carried moments like this, moments that were smoothed over and never addressed, moments that asked quietly to be remembered. The grandson had remembered. He had waited. And in doing so, he had learned that power did not need to announce itself to be real. It endured in restraint, in timing, in the courage to remain dignified even when dignity went unnoticed. That understanding shaped him more deeply than any confrontation ever could have. As the story came to rest, it did not offer comfort through certainty. It offered a question, suspended gently in the air, meant not to accuse but to awaken. A question that belonged as much to the listener as it did to the boy who had once stood silently in a room and watched respect disappear. How many people have you watched get shamed and stayed silent?